Hello, welcome back to History of Wine and the Vine. I'm Emily Kate. So this week I decided to kind of discuss the history of a topic that is so pervasive in the wine industry. So we're going to be kind of analyzing why wine has its prestige factor. So wine's obviously known as a very expensive beverage, a very prestigious beverage, but why? So let's look back. Well, historically, wine, from grape growing to winemaking to marketing to consumption and disposal and everything, aging, is just wasteful and expensive. And so because of that, it was really only available to the elites of any given era to kind of partake in. So that's where the basis, the crux of what we're going to discuss kind of comes from. So first off, the upfront costs. The upfront costs of starting a winery are huge. And it's not just the upfront costs, it's kind of, so you have the land, which is very expensive, you have to buy the vines, you have to kind of get stakes, and there's a lot of skilled labor that goes along with it. Now, if you compare this to other ventures today, it might not seem as expensive, but when you think about in antiquity, you had kind of the Mediterranean triad, which was, as you know, wheat and olives and vines. So if you take kind of like grain, olive, and vine was always the most expensive one. So if you think about that, and then you also think about the fact that it took 5 to 6 years after your investment in the land and the vines for your vines to even produce anything you could turn into wine, this was only a game for very wealthy people. So then you also have the idea that, let's say you were just wealthy enough to do this, if you had a bad vintage and you really couldn't sell your wine, or you couldn't even make wine out of what you had, you would lose everything. So it was really only people that had that extra cash to kind of fall back on that were even engaging in this. So then we kind of have the problems of, once you make the wine, of aging, if you're talking about ancient times. Remember, medieval time didn't have aging because they had oxygenation problems with their barrels as opposed to amphora. So in ancient times you had the problems with aging, and then it was always very expensive to ship wine. So wine would be kind of shipped elsewhere where people either couldn't grow grapes, or where wine wasn't as good, or just as a prestige factor, it was very kind of, it was a matter of showing off that you had wine from afar, or you had kind of an addition to wine. For instance, people used to add saffron from India into their wine in the Mediterranean to show that they could pay kind of the shipment costs, which is similar to today. If you're in the States and drinking French wine, or if you're somewhere else and you're drinking Australian wine, whatever it is, the shipment cost is negligible today, but is still kind of that prestige factor of importing. So nowadays, it's kind of different as well, because back then, in some places, wine was the number one beverage, but in other places, wine was really not the beverage of choice. So people would generally be drinking beer, for instance, in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. So you had the trouble of actually finding a market for your wine for people to buy. And then on the other hand, if wine was the number one drink of choice, it kind of drove down the price. So it was kind of hard for people to find a balance, which meant that it was a risky game to kind of be playing in. Again, only wealthy people could kind of be involved in this. So next you have the fact that there's waste. So conspicuous consumption has always been kind of a hallmark of the elite class. And the bottom line is, you don't really need to make wine. In many instances, that person did not need to be making wine for sale or for other people, and whereas there was a lot of kind of people making their own wine, which might have been necessary when there wasn't safe water to drink, once people were kind of making wine for mass consumption, it wasn't as necessary as, say, taking that land away from making grain or growing olives. So it's definitely kind of a wasteful ordeal. Then next we kind of get into more of the interesting kind of things. So the effects of wine that made it prestige. One is that wine gave people courage, and it kind of fostered a group mentality. So what that means is that it was very attractive to the warrior class. So kind of think about in the Middle Ages, the warrior class that was kind of uprising from kind of creating this new three-tiered kind of social class system out of a two-tiered social class system. So definitely having that, and as well being able to kind of have a physical differentiation. So you either had wine or you didn't. And when wine was considered a kind of posh thing to have, it kind of self-propagated itself in its elite quality, because then elites, or people who wanted to be elite, like a rising aristocratic family, would make sure they had wine. And because of that, it was seen as something aristocratic. So you can see how it kind of propagated itself into this idea of being very, very prestigious and elite. So next, what I want to kind of read to you is based off of the idea that religion also played a factor, also was a factor and played a part in making wine so elite. So obviously religion and wine have been closely linked for a very long time, since paganism and then all the way forward through Judaism and Christianity. So whereas there used to be offerings of wine, there would also be kind of this idea that wine was the basis for the common meal. And this common meal could either be very inclusive or very exclusionary. So when it was exclusionary, it would be kind of like the elites of the time, who were kind of like ministers and priests and things like this, and they would have wine at their table, and this just wasn't affordable for anybody else, and this kind of drove that prestige elite factor even further. And so I actually have a quote from Euripides' Cyclops, and he says, "O joy unmixed," unmixed wine he means, not mixed with water, "heaven seems brought low to earth and mingled with it. I see the throne of Zeus and the whole heavenly gathering of the gods." So clearly there was this idea that wine was a godly thing, a prestigious thing, something that connected you to something higher, and that was kind of brought down to the earth. So I think that that's actually pretty interesting as well. And wine was, once wine had its kind of elite properties, it was actually harnessed that way by politicians and kind of aristocratic people. So there were politicians like Aurelian, who used to actually dole out wine, kind of like bribe people to agree with his policies and to support him as, you know, the ruler by giving them wine. So politicians would create schemes where there were taxes specifically to kind of foster the creation of wine and to tax wine so that they could hand out wine to other people, keep everybody happy, make sure everybody was jolly the entire time. So clearly wine has always had an extremely close relationship to the kind of prestige industry, and I hope that you enjoyed learning about the history of it today. Give it a big thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe for more lectures, because there's always more to learn, and I will see you next week. Cheers!